Hi everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by John Helmer, a journalist who has been reporting from Moscow for more than 3 decades now, who is also the founder of the website Dances with Bears. So, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Glenn. Good to be here.
So, the NATO-Russia proxy war in Ukraine is fought both on the ground but also as a battle of narratives. And it seems that often the ideologically constructed narratives seem to, well, almost always prevail over objective reality. And again, as a journalist, you have a good ability to assess both of these two wars being fought. So, um, yeah, often when one discusses the war, it ends up being a discussion of the media unavoidably, given that yeah, the narratives have begun to deviate so much from reality. Uh, but I thought a good place to start would be then how do you assess, um, I guess, the possibility of peace? Because to end the proxy war, the Russians are demanding to resolve the root causes of the war. Now, you've been
hmm
following the growing tensions between NATO and Russia for the past 30 years. So, what are these root causes which you think Russia demands being resolved to end this conflict?
Well, to speak about the truth as distinct from the propaganda war, the truth is that for more than the 30 years in which I've been in Russia, um, and some people date this from, and I would, from the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, but even earlier in British history, uh, the root cause is that the European powers and then the United States, as the winner of World War II, have sought to destroy Russian power in Europe. And whether that was called anti-communism after the revolution or not, it's fundamentally um, an empire strategy of Great Britain first and then the United States. And to the extent that uh, Adolf Hitler of Germany had imperial ambitions or expansion ambitions, the destruction of the Soviet Union was an essential part of that. So the war's root cause dates long before the end of the Soviet Union. The root causes that President Putin is speaking of are the well-known advances of the so-called NATO powers eastwards, and the creation of war platforms, both covert war platforms and overt war platforms. Ukraine is an overt war battlefield and platform to attack to at first attack the Soviet Union and then to attack Russia. And that particular, let's call it, method of war against Russia followed years of post-war attempts to subvert Russia, both culturally, economically, and politically, to encourage independence movements, which all failed, to encourage, as you remember, the abandonment of Russia by intellectuals, and so forth and so on. I'm not telling you anything you don't remember. But it's the failure of these Cold War methods that have led on to the active war methods from 1991. And when the attempt to break up Russia, the Russian Federation, after 1991 and destroy its economic capacities first, its trading capacities, and then its military capacities, when that failed during the Clinton administration, despite every move that people like Boris Yeltsin and his circle made to concede the US advantage. When all of that failed, the strategy of destruction of Russia had to become more kinetic, let's say. And that's what's happened since 2014, with the overthrow of the Ukrainian government, of Yanukovych, and the building of a war-making platform with several lines of fortifications moving eastward to the preparation following the loss of the civil war by the Kiev regime, and ultimately with a plan of attack against Novorossiya and then the Russian mainland.
Well, yeah, from the 1990s, we saw a common theme, though, which was the idea that relations between the United States and Russia, or NATO and Russia, should be one of managing the decline of Russia as opposed to actually taking it, embracing it, taking it into the European security architecture. But as you said, when this didn't work, we saw these documents coming up, and the goal seems always to be to extend or weaken Russia. That is, peace depends on defeating or just subordinating Russia, as opposed to finding a way of living next to them, harmonizing interests, pursuing indivisible security.
Mm.
But given that we don't have any of these, well, given that the solution is always to defeat Russia, how do you see the response to the peace demands, or the concessions which Russia demands to end this conflict?
Do you mean your question to refer to the current position vis-a-vis the Trump administration? Yes.
Yeah, Trump and the Europeans.
Well,
Well, if I could elaborate, I guess Trump. Do you see this as being authentic? His desire to change the peace, to change this fundamentally, this confrontational relationship they've had with Russia for at least the past 100 years, or is this just, I guess, another deception, a bit of a pause to regroup before they continue?
the latter. It's very. Let's leave to one side the question of whether President Trump has a mind or not. That's doubtful. Second, let's come back to the question of how President Trump and his administration's propaganda work, calling war making peace, applying for the Nobel Peace Prize for fake peace arrangements, ceasefires, and so forth. Let's leave that aside for the minute. To go back to your question of what's authentic in the current negotiation, let's put it this way. And let's recognize that there are different factional assessments of the opportunity that arose for the Kremlin and for Russian policymakers, including the general staff, when the Biden regime was defeated in the election and President Trump came back for a second term. That's an opportunity, a strategic opportunity in which all decision-making factions in Moscow agreed. The question then became how to encourage the opportunity that arose after the total, let's call it, blackout of a Russian-hating regime led by a president in dementia, controlled by a group of Russia-hating individuals like Anthony Blinken and Victoria Nuland. Let's not make any mistake, and this isn't published in Moscow or in the United States, that people with identical Russia-hating backgrounds, both religious and familial, are in the Trump White House. And I don't just mean their administration. I mean the first floor of the White House, where you have the Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, whose background is identical to that of Blinken and Nuland. These are Russia-hating war fighters who have had families having this doctrine for 100 years or more. The question from the Russian point of view is that Trump runs a political campaign, wins a political campaign, committed to the notion that he could end the war in a few days' time. Let's leave aside the particular rhetoric of 24 hours. How to encourage that opportunity. At the same time, as we know, we had a telephone conversation between President Putin and President Trump on February the 12th, in which President Putin made a very important concession on the battlefield. He agreed to stop the electric war campaign, which was fundamentally the General Staff's view that the best way to win this war was to turn the lights out in the Ukraine so that the Eastern Front could not be easily supplied, and nor could the arms from the United States and the NATO allies come across the border into the Ukraine from Poland, Romania, and other sources. President Putin unilaterally offered that with the idea that there might be reciprocation on the Ukrainian side. There was no reciprocation. The Ukrainians have escalated, if anything, their attacks on Russian energy infrastructures, as you very well know, and as your programs have made very clear and creatively, importantly clear. So concessions have been made to slow down, by the Russian side, to slow down the General Staff's plan for bringing the Ukrainian war to an end on the terms that Russia was proposing. The terms that President Putin spelled out last June 2024, and repeated many times, have involved not the American idea of land swap, but rather the integration of Novorossiya, the 4 regions plus Crimea that are already legally part and constitutionally part of Russia, of the creation of a demilitarized zone of a depth required to protect the Russian mainland from any range weapon the NATO Americans would deploy on that battlefield, and the denazification of the regime in Kiev, which at the very least meant new elections. Okay, those were, to put it as simply as possible, the shortened version of by President Putin of a much bigger attempt to address the root cause. Let's say, to simplify it, the root cause was to end the prospect that the Ukrainian battlefield would continue to be a NATO redoubt for continuing the war for the destruction of Russia. Of course, the Russian side preceded the special military operation of February 2022 with 2 treaties. The 2 treaties offered to the United States and NATO, December 17, 2021, proposed a mutual security, reciprocal security architecture for Europe, which would have the effect, if accepted, of ending this 100-year-old war against Russia. In other words, to remove not only the Ukrainian battlefield as a NATO or a Western or an American redoubt against Russia, but would equally apply to Romania, to Poland, to Bulgaria, going southwards, going northwards from Poland to the Baltic states, Sweden, Norway, Finland, across the Arctic Circle to the Far East, and so on, and certainly deal with the threats that have materialized against the Russian Caucasus in Iran, or against Iran by Israel and the United States. That security architecture, you could say, the treaties to embody that framework, were dismissed summarily by Blinken, Newland, and the Biden administration. And that simply accelerated the decision in Moscow to have to save the situation in eastern Ukraine from an imminent Ukrainian attack and conserve the focus of Russian military targeting on the Ukrainian battlefield and leave the other battlefields till later. Well, here we are now. And the question you asked me appropriately, Glenn, is what does the Russian side think is the Trump administration's approach, and how much of an opportunity is still conceded? Well, in the first place, the Russian side acknowledges what the Trump administration says, And by saying, I don't mean simply the Trump tweet machine. We'll come back to that as a very interesting form of propaganda in a minute. The US policy is one of getting out of the Ukraine as a battlefield for the United States, putting in its place, if they wish to pay the United States, the European powers, and then extending the same formula. Europe pays, the US supplies, the US through NATO commands and controls the new battlefields running from the Ukraine through Poland, through the Baltics, through the Baltics, Finland, and then across the Arctic Circle to the Far East, as well as in the Southern Caucasus. So what that's been called by Elbridge Colby, the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy, is sequencing the wars so that the US doesn't face losing a war for lack of capacity on any particular battlefield. Losing a war is the preoccupation, personal one and a political one and a re-election one for President Trump himself and those around him. Losing this war is what they don't want. Now, I don't want to mix what you've asked me about how the Russian policymaking factions think with what my analysis is of the Trump administration. So if I put them together, let me say this and then stop. The Russian opportunity remains. What does Trump personally know about the Russian terms instead of what he hears from his emissaries like Stephen Witkoff and others? Does he know what the Russian terms were in Istanbul? Does he know and appreciate what President Putin actually said? And that was the purpose of President Putin agreeing to meet in Anchorage, Alaska, when the meeting place should have either been Istanbul in May or Abu Dhabi or Dubai instead of Alaska. Putin was clear he wanted to go to the Emirates, to UAE, but he agreed to go to Alaska. The purpose was to make clear to Trump what, and for the Russian side to understand what did he know and what would he do next. And the meeting, we know from the papers that slipped out of the State Department into the press, was considerably foreshortened. It was to be more than 4 hours. It was shortened to 2. The press conference was to be 1 hour. It was shortened to 12 minutes. The entire program was foreshortened when Trump said he wanted to go home. And what happened was, from a Russian point of view, a set of small gains, an understanding that Trump finally heard it from Putin. And you heard a form of Trump hearing it from Putin impatiently when, out of the 12 minutes of the press conference, President Putin spoke from notes for 8 of those minutes. So there's no doubt that Trump now knew directly, face to face. Second, there was an understanding. Yesterday, President Putin referred to as an understanding. In Tianjin, in China, he also referred to as an agreement. Yuri Ushakov, his foreign policy advisor, has referred to both terms as understandings or agreements. What were they? Principally, Trump has told Putin he was willing to delay all significant offensive action against Russia. And that particularly meant the suspension or delay of imposition of secondary sanctions against India and others for trading with Russian oil and gas. Now, that delay ended very quickly. And it's not certain for me that Trump even understood that on August 15, he was granting delay. August 27, the 50% punishment for India for trading with oil was imposed. And on September 1, finally, President Trump issued a tweet signifying that he finally knew that the secondary sanctions had been applied, but he held out a little hope that it might not be too late. In other words, he might withdraw those. So that episode demonstrated to the Russian side what the opportunity is and what the limitations are. And as recently, pardon me, as 2 days ago, Yuri Ushakov has explained that in Tianjin, where the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was held, there were discussions with all of Russia's strategic allies, and it was understood that there'd been a delay offered by Trump, but no implementation of any of the structures for continuing the negotiation. No structures, no working groups, no further exchanges to prepare for the so-called trilateral meeting of Trump, Zelensky, and Putin. No preparation for an agenda, no preparation for terms. Instead, what we've seen is a blizzard of 2 or 3 or 4 so-called European plans for dividing the territory of the Ukraine westward of the current contact line into demilitarized zone, buffer zone, reassurance force zone, installation of new and remilitarized Ukrainian army. Now, the minute those plans are adopted by the US side, and they are half sponsored by the US side, but not yet endorsed by Trump himself, we are talking about remilitarizing the Ukraine, and that's a non-starter, to say politely, for the Russian side.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Europeans, because this relationship between the US and Europe appears to be changing now. Obviously, as the Russians are winning the war, it's quite predictable that the United States would seek some kind of a de-escalation. But I guess after this is where the Russians become a bit cautious, because they would like then to find a way of not just de-escalating, but then putting a final end to this conflict and the root causes. But it does appear that, especially with the Europeans, that they want to have the options of escalating later once they've regained the strength, reorganized. So again, not finish off this completely. I mean, this is kind of a unique, well, I guess you can call it an opportunity to have hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers possibly being used in the future as a balance against the Russians. So this is not something they want to walk away from right away. But with the United States, one never gets a real clear commitment which way they're going to go. And again, it often seems that it falls within this strategic ambiguity. But do you think the Americans are only after a different distribution of labor between them and the Europeans, as the Europeans are expected then to continue the war against Russia, to continue financing it, while the US doesn't have to take responsibility for losing the war? They can make some money of it by selling the equipment, and also have the opportunity to start some bilateral ties with Russia to make sure that they have, that they don't isolate themselves from one of these Eurasian giants, and I guess make the Europeans paid all of the cost. Or do you think there's something more genuine behind this in terms of reorganizing relations?
What do you mean by genuine, Glenn?
Yeah, that's a great. Well, well, maybe authentic. That is, that they actually want a permanent end to the war. So is the goal here to actually end the war, or just I guess climb down the escalation ladder? Because when you're a dominant power, what you often seek is escalation dominance. You increase the
Yes.
tensions when you want, and then you de-escalate when it's appropriate. But ending a conflict altogether, then you lose control over this escalation dominance. So because that reduces your ability to escalate in the future when it's of use. So so in other words, do you see any indications that Americans are prepared to actually give up this escalation dominance, that they're willing to
No.
put an end to
And
this?
I think that's, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I think that's the right way, the right terminology. There's no evidence whatsoever that either at a personal level for President Trump, or in the Department of Defense, in the White House, and this strange mixture of the National Security Council and the State Department that's being created, or in the intelligence agencies. There is neither a shortage of Russia-hating warfighters of exactly the same kind as I've said, of the Blinken gang of the previous administration. But second, there is absolutely no readiness to concede escalation dominance. On the contrary, the whole notion of make America great again, make the empire, the American empire great again, MAGA and MEGA, are personal, psychological commitments of President Trump. He thinks winning war at home and abroad is the essence of MAGA. And that means escalation control. And we don't need to go into the detail of how he thought he had attacked Iran, and he used the word obliteration 8 or 10 times within a 10-minute speech on the so-called US raid on the Iranian nuclear plants. Obliteration is the final outcome of escalation control. Second, you've heard his rhetoric of I've made peace between India and Pakistan. That's a nonsense. But if you want, we can talk about each of these. Peace between Congo and Rwanda. Peace between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Peace between Kosovo and Serbia. Peace between Iran and Israel. Each one of these things, and each one of his spokesmen, whether it's Witkoff, Miller, or the others, keep echoing the same point. And the entire campaign, which your prime minister, the Norwegian prime minister, was urged by Trump, you remember, at the White House to lobby the Nobel Prize winning committee to arrange. Each one of these things is a psychological assertion of the expansion of the US empire, and it's for Trump a personal exhibition of personal power expressed both domestically and in on the foreign platforms. So there's no intention to do anything like accept de-escalation in that sense. It's the same inside the United States, and now I speak as an American, as a long-term professor once in the United States and so forth. And so I'm now talking about US politics. Escalation dominance is the policy of the Trump administration as it militarizes the administration of the major cities where there's opposition to Trump. That's Washington, D.C., it's Los Angeles, and it's Chicago coming next. Militarization, literally putting troops on the street, whether the courts order it to be removed, whether the courts consider it to be unconstitutional and so forth, won't matter. Trump and Miller and the others have decided to militarize the domestic control of potentially Democratic Party cities. So there's absolutely no readiness on the US part to concede escalation control dominance at home. And on the foreign platforms, one can see sequencing of war means reduction of the potential for losing the Ukraine war, of the Russian side forcing the Ukraine to capitulation, unconditional capitulation, substituting that possibility by negotiating with President Putin to come to terms that would leave a rump Ukraine that could be rebuilt and remilitarized. There's no concession of escalation dominance there. Now, the Russian side, which has different factional views about what to do tactically, operationally, and strategically at the moment inside the battlefield of Ukraine, but the Russian side understands, and I may be I doubt I'm surprising you or our audience, do not believe that the United States will not come back to this war later. The Russian side, in my view, has come to the consensus Russia will also benefit from a pause for regrouping, reorganizing, and reallocating resources for the resumption of the war on the Ukraine battlefield and the escalation of war against Russia. As I said, Poland, the Baltics, Finland to go in that direction, and in the south as well. So what we're looking at is a negotiation of terms for pause without the Russian side giving up its escalation dominance on the battlefield. How can the US side achieve that with the Europeans? I, for one, do not see the kind of splitting between the Europeans and the Americans that some wishful thinking podcasters wish to see. On the other hand, there's no doubt the Russian side would like to encourage splitting between the United States and some of the Europeans. The Russian side would like to encourage it. So far, there's no sign I can see that a Russian negotiating strategy has either divided the Europeans or divided the Europeans from the Americans. But if you raise the question, why do the European regimes think that continuation of the war, this war against Russia, is good politics, will keep them in power and keep themselves and their constituents in money? That's a different question, isn't it?
Yeah, well, the European position in terms of the ceasefire seems to be motivated by the calculation that, of course, a ceasefire and attempting to equate this to peace is something that would be impossible for Russia to accept. However, if they can get the Americans on board with this idea that the ceasefire is peace, then it would be ideal because the conflict would continue, but also they could sell it as it's the Russians who are against peace. And then,
Yes.
then Trump can unleash his fury on the Russians instead of pressuring the Europeans to make any real concessions. But some of the other things the Europeans are calling for, though, sending troops, demanding reparations from Russia, continuing to talk about NATO expansion, demanding security guarantees, not for Russia, of course, but only for Ukraine.
Yes.
All of this just appears to be, still packed with a lot of self-harm, because when you're losing a war, you would assume there would be some efforts to, reduce some of these losses. However,
Well, but you're right. These are tripwires, Glenn. They're tripwires to make it appear, just as you said, that the Russian side is responsible for the continuation of the war. The Russian side won't negotiate authentically and with goodwill. The Russian side, first, would not agree to the immediate ceasefire. Now, I think the Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, kept mentioning ceasefire at the last roundtable that the European leaders had in the White House. I think that was no longer the tripwire of, and we moved on to the meeting with Zelensky. That's the Russian side have avoided that, and Trump has not, having dropped the ceasefire and accepted the notion of a peace agreement with security guarantees. He had moved his tripwire a distance from Merz's, for example. Then the Europeans offered another tripwire because they knew President Putin will not meet Zelensky. He will meet Trump, but not Zelensky, unless there is more than a public relations opportunity. That tripwire has been exercised, and it's not quite working. So the next tripwire has been the security guarantees. And just, you said it rightly, Glenn, the security guarantees that have been developed, that have been leaked in the last week in the Telegraph, the London Telegraph plan of 3 zones and multiple lines of fortifications and reassurance forces placed, the the report that's appeared in the Wall Street Journal and the Politico that US troops might go on the ground, but they won't be US troops. They'll be contractors. They'll be private mercenaries. These are all leaks of various forms of the security guarantee tripwire, all of which can't possibly be accepted by the Russian side as it advances west. So they're tripwires designed to show and blame Russia for having started the war in the first place, having no intention of ending the war, of intending to go beyond this war to the next platform. And all of that's part of the narrative with which you began, which is that Russia is a strategic existential threat to the survival of Europe. It does things like invent dire nerve chemicals like the name Novichok, and attacks on British soil, innocent individuals, proving that President Putin is himself a murderer who respects no human right, no international law, etc., etc. So the Novichok narrative was a build-up, the creation of the British government in the first place, and then the German government with Alexei Navalny in the second place, part of the narrative of building the public support for a war-making strategy, which was already part of European policy and is still part of European policy and is still part of the US. So because as you said, as we began, the Russian side is winning on this platform. The problem is how none of the combatants on the other side wish to accept the political losses of having lost on this battlefield. So they continue, but the sums of money at stake are huge, as you know. The hundreds of billions of euros worth of rearmament expenditure are being promised by von der Leyen of the European Union, by Merz of Germany, by Zelensky and his US counterparts like General Kellogg for the future. These are very huge money stakes for the European regimes and Zelensky himself. So there's no readiness to stop and every readiness to find the tripwire that makes Russia to blame. And that's a propaganda narrative.
Well, based on some, yes, the previous documents from the United States, especially from Rand Corporation and others, it appears that the ideal war for NATO would be to have something between Ukrainian proxy and Russia that would just be, I guess, low intensity to go over years and years, just to gradually bleed Russia, to overextend it, perhaps begin to destabilize society a bit from within. But this, of course, now has gone somewhat out of control, and as we see now, the front lines cracking, not just cracking, the amount of advancements of the Russians seems to be growing quickly. The casualty rates on the Ukrainian side appears to be growing quickly as well. So we appear to be reaching some kind of a breaking point now. So far, the United States, or at least under Trump, has tried to play the peacemaker. That is, he argues he's a mediator. You mentioned Miller, he made the same point. It's not our war, we're just trying to bring peace. But at the same time, Trump has recognized this is Biden's war. NATO should not try to expand. So on one side, he's recognizing this is a war. Yeah.
Trump has said nothing about NATO should not expand. Nothing at all. He said that's not what he said, but even if he says some things that could be construed that way, he says other things that are quite the opposite. I don't believe you could point to any commitment on Trump's side to suggest that he opposes the expansion of NATO. Rather, he will be happy to send an invoice for NATO expansion so long as the weapons are the US weaponry, and the command structure will remain US commander. Grinkovich, I've forgotten exactly how that's the the current Sacker pronounces his name. Command and control will remain American. Battlefield intelligence and targeting coordination will remain American. But the payment for all of this will be from the European states to put in Trump's pocket. And by putting it in Trump's pocket, I mean literally. The bribes involved in this passing through Witkoff and his family members, and Howard Lutnick, the Minister of Commerce in the US. These are very, very large, and they dwarf the bribes that the Biden family or the Clinton family took in their relations with these matters. They dwarf the Clinton and Biden bribery involved in Ukrainian warfare. But I see no evidence that Trump wants to shorten or diminish NATO's powers. What I think is happening is a narrative that's essentially putting absolutely back to front, making war and calling it peace, making it a huge US a profit-making venture, and concentrating US military power where it makes the biggest bang. And that's partly to support Israel in Iran. It's certainly to support Israel in the genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza. And we could go around the world identifying each one of the wars the US continues to run, including those that you've just touched on in your broadcast, the current war against Venezuela.
But what I wanted to get to, though, is how, well, I guess, when do you think the Russians consider using their very powerful Oreshnik missile? Because, I mean, what would trigger this? Because it's very likely that as the front lines collapses, they're not going to be able to talk the Russians into accepting any ceasefire or any empty promises. That there will be some form of escalation. Indeed, Trump just announced that they would sell a few thousand missiles now to the Europeans, who will give them to the Ukrainians. So, at what point do you see dramatic escalation? Because the last stages of a war can be quite dramatic, as the losing side, believing it has a lot to lose, would be willing to take very great risks.
Well, this is a good question. And there's a general staff view, there's an intelligence service view, there's a Kremlin view, and there are other views in Moscow. The Oreshnik is a decapitation weapon for the Ukrainian battlefield. And it's not going to be used unless there was a clear gain from the removal of Zelensky, Yermak, and the Ukrainian General Staff. And for the time being, I think both the consensus in Moscow and the consensus around Kiev is that Zelensky has so far won the battle for succession. If there's to be a new election in the Ukraine, he will win it. General Zaluzhny will not win it. Former President Poroshenko will not win it. And what we're seeing from the assassination of Andrei Parubi is that the Azovists are fighting now among themselves. So the position on the Russian side, the assessment on the Russian side at this stage of the game, and it's premature to say this is a policy, is that decapitation would not achieve a political outcome that would be favorable to Russia, when the more important military outcome is to remove the capacity of the Ukrainian armed forces and their supplies and their intelligence sharing with the United States their drone factories, their longer range missile capabilities, including the Flamingo they promise for the future. You don't need Oreshniki to hit those targets. What you do need is to turn the electricity off from the entire country. And that's something, strangely, that President Putin has not allowed the general staff to proceed to, because there's been a suspension of electric war targeting in the West, certainly from Kiev to the Polish border. Second, day before yesterday, President Putin had a conversation with the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico, in which he suggested to the Slovakians that they should cut their electricity supplies to the Ukraine in retaliation for Ukrainian attacks on the Druzhba delivery of oil and gas to Slovakia. Now, if Putin tells Fico, why don't you cut your electricity supply to the Ukraine, how come President Putin does not tell the general staff, take out the electricity in the west of the Ukraine? Well, it's a paradox. It's also moving in time. We are approaching the time when there are other ways of ending this war, bringing the Ukrainian side to unconditional capitulation. And obviously, and you've said it already, Glenn, the European allies and the US don't want to see that happening as their defeat. So that's both a narrative problem for them and a military problem for them. So that's a long-winded way of saying the Oreshniki is the Oreshnik singular, Oreshniki plural, are not needed now to achieve the battlefield goals the Russian side are capable of. Second, Oreshnik as a deterrent for the rebuilding or expansion of bases. Your country, Norway, is now playing a bigger and bigger role in eastern Poland to build up a base for NATO operations. Germany and Norway are replacing the US troops in Poland around Rechov to create a future launching pad for more war, either through the Ukraine or directly against Belarus, and so on and so on and so on. So the Oreshnik was initially used as a demonstration to show, to underline the Russian position. If you, a NATO country, allow your territory or your forces to attack us, we have the capability you cannot defend against to retaliate. A kind of symmetrical tit for tat, but bear it in mind. Well, there's no evidence whatever that Norway, Poland, Germany, Bulgaria, Romania are bearing it in mind. In fact, they're doing everything to escalate. And some of these paper plans that have been leaked imply even more expansion of these US NATO bases just across the border from the Ukraine. So, is Oreshnik to be used against or to be threatened against them? Well, yes, it is, but it's a threat. The Romanians have a nuclear-capable US Aegis missile base in southern Romania. Poland has a comparable nuclear-capable base in northern Poland. And what we see, and you know just as well as I do, that there's every form of reinforcement and escalation of the delivery of US nuclear weapons moving forward into Europe. So against these, Oreshnik ought to be a non-nuclear, but a deterrent. But there's no sign that the Europeans accept that they're at risk.
Yeah, no, the ability to assess risks appears to have diminished. My last question was just based on how you see developments now on the battleground, the failure of diplomacy to move forward, from I guess infighting in Ukraine to the West, the Western own economic problems and military support. How do you see this war ending now? Is this going to end on the battlefield, or do you, I guess, have any projections?
Which war are we talking about, Glenn? The Ukraine war or
Yeah,
the
sorry.
broader American NATO war? Do we agree that? Do you agree? Do we agree that there will be an extended war? There's no relaxation of that. Are we simply focusing now on the Ukraine platform or on the broader one? Which shall we discuss?
Well, let's make it both.
All
How
right.
is this? Yeah. Well, the
Well,
Ukraine one might be easier to predict, but it's also interesting to assess the wider direction of this conflict between Russia and Europe. That being said, I think the Russians have now signaled clearly that their decoupling from Europe will be quite permanent as they're now pursuing economic partnerships in the East.
well, yes. You made a point earlier, which I'd like to come back to, and that is that the Russian side have obviously hung out very substantial financial lures to the United States, to the United States business community, um, for as inducements for and as rewards, both individual bribes and major corporate investment profits, in finding a set of accommodations that would reduce US sanctions against Russia in order to increase US business with Russia. Now, you can see that in the recent negotiation that was reported between Rosneft and ExxonMobil over the possibility that ExxonMobil could resume its oil drilling and its oil operations at the Sakhalin-1 oil fields, that the Russian side does not want to abandon the possibility of financial inducements to the United States, and they would apply equally to the European states if they wanted to give up the war option. And the Russian side has appointed Kirill Dmitriev as special representative of the Kremlin, as you know, for talking business. The US talking inducements, to talking bribery, talking profit other than war, talking money, not force. The counterpart in the US is Stephen Witkoff and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and their various family members. The counterparts in Europe aren't anywhere near as active, but some European countries differ from others, as you know. So money remains an inducement that the Russian side, money and profit remain inducements the Russian side wants to offer as an alternative to ending the war in a military way. So we should emphasize that possibility is on the table. But the profit calculations of Starmer, von der Leyen, Macron, Merz, and Stubb, just to name a few, their profit calculations entirely based on the remilitarization of their economies and the armaments escalation programs that they're all discussing. So they are not interested in the money. They're interested in the arms. What happens if the Ukrainian war ends in unconditional capitulation of the Ukrainian military? How would that work? Well, the first word to use is slowly. It won't be achieved fast. At the operational level, one can see there are very good analyses that are not pro-Russian. I can mention one in particular that's not pro-Russian. Mark Takash is a Hungarian analyst, a military analyst of operational level engagements along the line of contact. And what you see is accelerating operational gains from company level to battalion level, increasing Russian operational ambition to move westwards, especially through some of the salient Zaporozhye, perhaps a priority, feinting and deception operations by the Russian side in order to confuse the Americans, the British, the Ukrainians, and others as to where they will move next and with what level of force. You see a range of operations which take time, a lot of time, to complete at the level at which the general staff are satisfied that they will minimize Russian casualties and maximize Russian gains. That's a slow process. Can it be accelerated with more weaponry on the Russian side, more manpower? Yes, it can, but it's unlikely to be accelerated now. Look at what the month is. We're now in September, in the autumn. So we are approaching a new round of winter operations, the nature of which is different from the summer operations, as you know. So I would say the war ends slowly in the Ukraine. I've never been as confident as some US retired military podcasters that, having defeated the Ukraine and defeated the US weaponry, the military victory will be fast. And I know Russian sources officially who think the outcome will be fast. It'll be slow. Slow also means the destruction of certain elite Azov units. They represent, or would represent in a political solution, if they were withdrawn to the West, the backbone of the new remilitarization of the Ukraine on Nazi principles. If they start to kill each other in Kiev or in Lvov, and the Russian side can destroy their units and their command control around Pokrovsk, which is what's going on right now, the scope for denazification west of the Kiev is greater. So at the operational level, there's slow advance. Yes, you're right. The rate of casualties announced by the Russian Defense Ministry each day is running higher, 12 to 1,300 a day. Whether you accept the number exactly, the rate of increase is significantly greater than it was several months ago. It's likely to grow more as we go along, but the process westward is slow. What will the US side do to stop or deter Russia? Well, we've just seen what they've attempted to do against India. In other words, to escalate the attack on the allies as if cutting the oil trade or attacking tankers. Let's remember that the US and the British are engaging special forces to attack the so-called black tanker trade, hit those tankers physically. What will happen if the US side decides to implement what President Trump has just announced once again, his disappointment with President Putin? I'm reaching for a piece of paper in which I'm looking at Trump's latest August 29 statements, where he's asked on the radio on the 29th what he's going to do and what he thinks will happen next. He says, let me see if I can, I'll just read the question. You mentioned, I believe, in a Truth Social post that there was a big thing that you and Putin didn't agree on in Alaska. What was that big thing? Question. Trump, I don't know. We got along. We saw it, we've had a good relationship over the years. That's why I really thought we would have this done. I would have loved, past tense, to have had it done. Maybe they have to fight a little longer. Just keep fighting. Stupidly keep fighting. Now, that's what he said the other day on the 29th. On the September 2, where he recovered from his illness and wanted to prove he wasn't dead, which is what the social media was saying. Take a look at him. His voice was still breaking, and he'd lost his artificial suntan. So, but he was alive. Question at September 2. Have you spoken with President Putin in the past week? Donald Trump. Yeah, I don't want to. I've learned things that will be very interesting. I think in the next few days you'll find out. Question. Are there any consequences if there isn't some type of announcement of a meeting with President Putin and President Zelensky? Trump answer. Yeah, I won't convert the English. Yeah, there will be consequences. We're going to see what happens. We're going to see what they do and what happens. I'm watching it very closely. And then he repeats the same old thing about how many people are dying. Question. China's having a massive military parade that President Putin and Kim Jong-un will be attending. Do you interpret that as a challenge to you, to this? Trump. No. Are you concerned at all about these countries not trying to be some sort of counterweight? Trump. Not at all. China needs us. And I have a very good relationship with President Xi, as you know. But China needs us much more than we need them. No, I don't see that at all. No. And I had actually a very good meeting with President Putin a couple of weeks ago. We'll see if anything comes out of it. If it doesn't, we'll take a different stance. I hope you'll be patient that with my reading what this man said in the last 48 hours. There's a clear warning there that his patience is running out, his so-called patience. Does he know what he was going to do next? Answer, it's as unclear that he knows what he's going to do next as it was unclear what he would do to the Indians. So to go back to your question, Glenn, how does the Ukraine war end on the battlefield? And I go back to my answer. Slowly, step by step, depending as President Putin sees what President Trump does and then responds. And the Russian style, well, it's better to call it President Putin's style, is symmetrical, tit for tat. And if the US side, using Zelensky, attempts something asymmetrical in an attack on Russia, for example, the drone attack symbolically on the Russian Tupolev bomber nuclear delivery, a leg of the triad. That was a symbol of an attack on Russian nuclear capacity. The attacks on Russian gasification in Ust-Luga and Russian fuel refineries in the south. Those are all in escalations against which President Putin has authorized the general staff to implement symmetrical attacks. If the US side then goes asymmetrical, and that's what Trump appears to be hinting at, the Russian side will go asymmetrical too. But the outcome, slow.
Well, John Helmer, thank you so much. It's very strange to watch the decisions being made at the moment, not just in the United States and Europe. There's so many contradictions. They seem to be going back and forth, but actually, if we would take a step back, it does appear that not that much has really changed. There is, in terms of the major objectives.
I don't see the contradictions. We don't disagree, Glenn, but I don't see that there are the contradictions that are either hoped for on the Russian side or claimed on the, let's call it the podcaster side. What I see, however, is the exhaustion of the Russian theory of Trump opportunity. That's running out. But if you've got a minute, let me go back to the point that we began with, the difference between the propaganda narrative when the European side will say we're winning the war, the Russian side say, well, you're losing the war. When the US side says we aim to make peace. When Stephen Miller says we are not part of this war. We are not a combatant. We are only engaged in a humanitarian mission. Why do they say things that are so obviously false? Well, a White House operative is essentially talking to the domestic constituencies. And we have to understand from a White House political calculation that President Trump is gaining no votes, no improved approval for his handling of the Russia-Ukraine war. In fact, and I'm looking at my chart here of polling, the Gallup polling shows that disapproval of President Trump's handling of the situation in the Ukraine has been growing between March and July. Approval was 41% in March of his handling of the Ukraine war. It's dropped to 33 in July. That's a -8 loss for a White House calculation. That's a significant loss. The only comparable loss of support for what Trump says he's doing, war is peace, and so forth, is on immigration. Looking at the Gallup poll, in February 2025, there was a 46% popular approval for Trump's handling of the immigration issue. In July 2025, it was 38, -8 points. Now, nothing could be more dramatic from American domestic politics than the handling of immigration, the militarization of the cities, the creation of a new federal police force called ICE, and so forth and so on, and the demonstration of cruel deportation, men in chains being flown back to other countries. If that's not approved inside Trump's base, then Trump's base is shrinking. Okay? Now, if you've got those calculations, they are domestic calculations that the chief of staff, the deputy chiefs of staff, simply advised Trump, we are losing votes. We are not gaining votes from our propaganda offensive. And that stimulates Trump to what you described correctly as escalation dominance, more demonstration of, quotes, the obliteration tactic that was used on Iran. It doesn't persuade US voters, but for the time being, Trump believes that it does. Now, people like Miller control Trump's tweeting. It's a complete misapprehension of how the White House works to think that Trump improvises these tweets and improvises these short press conferences. For a start, the press conferences are now manipulated so that only the press who are briefed to ask the questions are trusted near him. And so the question and the answer are always prepared in advance. So are the tweets. Miller controls speech writing. He controls the social media. And he reports to Wiles, Susan Wiles, the chief of staff. And you can see from the floor plan of the White House itself how close they are around the president. Now, this is a unique propaganda narrative forming unit in which they believe not only that they must demonstrate escalation dominance, but if they think they're losing in one place, they will remove their violence to another place. To the extent that they want to delay against Iran or against Russia, they will escalate on the Panama Canal and in Venezuela. They think that makes support. They are wrong in calculating, but it's understandable that they think that. At the same time, inside the White House, you have individuals like Witkoff who keep saying, well, if we delay with Russia, we've got a better chance of negotiating some business deals, either for ExxonMobil, for example, or Boeing, which is in need, and they'll pick various corporations around the United States that are very important to their the midterm election calculations and subsequently to the presidential vote in 2028. So you have to see what's happening. I don't think it's a set of contradictions. I think what is happening is that where we started. On this particular battlefield, Russia is winning. The US, Ukraine, European side are losing, but the European regimes are making money. The US side is making money. The remilitarization of NATO, the remilitarization of the Ukraine is accelerating. Now, how to put that in a narrative and call it peace, that's what people are very well paid to do in the mainstream media. And it's up to important podcasters like you to say this is untrue. It's inauthentic. It's not real. But let's be fair. We are a tiny minority voice. There is no significant anti-war movement in the United States or in Germany or in England. Why did the Novichok narrative be so universally accepted in England without opposition? Why, among many reasons, these narratives accepted is there's an increase in repression of our line, if you like, the opposition line, the attempt by people of goodwill and brains to show that what the official narrative is untrue. There's a loss of the platforms for this kind of resistance. The universities are no longer independent in the propaganda war. They've been replaced by think tanks funded by the United States, by the states, the European states, or by their defense corporations. There are no mass political party resistance. There, therefore, very little parliamentary resistance. So we're in a tiny minority saying this is what's true and that's what's false. While the let's say propaganda war has been won by the other side, the military war has been lost by the other side. But so long as the propaganda war continues in the way it's going, that side makes money and they think it makes votes. Now, until the votes change, and there's no sign of that soon, is there? This war continues. There's never been a weaker German chancellor, has there? With a 24 to 28% mandate? Has there ever been a weaker German chancellor running a remilitarization policy towards Russia that Adolf Hitler thought might work? A weak chancellor compared to Hitler with the same objectives against Russia? How does one make that into a propaganda line that the German people can accept? Answer: repress them, make them afraid, destroy their universities, destroy their press, destroy their publications, their bookshops, make everyone in Germany afraid to open their mouth. And I think you might agree that's what's happening in Germany now, isn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately so. It's I have noticed that not just in Germany but around Europe, the lack of acceptance or tolerance of any dissent. It's this idea that I think any dissent it goes so straight to the heart of the wider ideological narrative of what we're doing in Ukraine, what this world order under the liberal hegemon is supposed to represent. That any dissent becomes seen as an attack on the West itself, as an attack on the role of liberal democracy. It's just no, it's facts and discussion, and dissent has no place anymore, which is a great shame. But again, thank you so much for your time. It's greatly appreciated.
Thank you very much for having me.